All right, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm here. I'm John Pattison. I'm the content manager for Strong Towns, and I am joined by Arian Horbovetz. Arian is a name that will be familiar to regular Strong Towns readers. He is the founder of the Urban Phoenix blog and podcast. He's been a contributor to Strong Towns since at least April 2016. That's the earliest that I found. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right, yes.
Okay. So a long time, coming on 4 years, contributor to Strong Towns. And he is coming to us from Rochester, New York. Arian, you and I have been able to talk on the phone a couple times, but this is the first time we've been sort of in a video chat together.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, thanks for being willing to do this. It's kind of an experiment for us, and I'm glad that we were able to do it with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I love any chance I can get to interact with Strong Towns. I think your message is fantastic, and you know, I'm always happy to have a conversation about smart cities going forward.
Yeah, that's awesome. Very, very cool. So, you know, I think what would be helpful certainly for me, and probably for the viewers and listeners as well, is maybe to kind of understand a little bit more of sort of your geographic context. So yeah. I mentioned that you're in Rochester. Can you describe sort of where you live in Rochester and what your day-to-day life is like there?
Yeah, absolutely. Rochester is a city of about 200,000 people. Used to be about 350,000. Of course, we're here in the Rust Belt. You know, so like so many cities in this area, you know, we've seen about a 40% decrease in population over the last 30, 40 years. But it's, you know, as so many cities are now, it is a city that has found its legs again. We have some wonderful young people here that are doing people young and old that are really rediscovering what an urban area can be again. And you talk about geographics, and the important thing to understand about New York is a big state. So when I tell a lot of people from out of state that I'm from New York, they think New York City. I am a 7.5-hour train ride to New York City. Wow, yeah. On a good day. And yeah, I'm hundreds and hundreds of miles away from New York City. I'm nowhere near it. I'm actually we're closer to Toronto. So much closer to Toronto than New York City. So, you know, the state is kind of interesting because you have this tremendous, boom in New York City. You have all this financial investment and financial growth. And yet for a very long time here upstate, we've experienced a level of financial stagnation and even population decline. So it's an interesting place to be because in some ways I think this is a blank slate for tremendous investment moving forward. And at the same time, it's fighting 30 years of stagnation and trying to change the conversation in a city that has been very silent for a very long time. But we are seeing some really, really great things happening here. One of the most exciting things that we have, and I just got to pitch this real quick here in Rochester. We are one of the smaller cities to be doing to be basically participating in an expressway repurposing. So our inner loop, which encircled our cities for decades, we're filling that in the city. We just filled in the east side of it a few years ago, and now construction is in full force on top of it, basically creating 800,000 square feet of developable space where there was none before. We're seeing apartments going in there. We're seeing mixed use. We're seeing our Strong Museum of Play, home of the National Toy Hall of Fame, which is a great family resource for our city. They're really building into that area and expanding into that. So we're seeing a creation of a neighborhood where there wasn't one before. Now, we're used to hearing about this and seeing this in bigger cities. This is a city of 200,000 people, and we're very, very excited about the continued progress of that project.
That sounds incredible. Now, this is before you and I started recording, as we were sort of chatting back and forth, we were talking about how important it is that that the conversation around urbanism, placemaking, those sorts of things is not just focused on sort of the big metro areas, New York City, LA, San Francisco, that sort of thing. That
Yes.
it's important that it is happening in places like Rochester, in rural communities like the one I live in Oregon. Can you talk, I mean, and you just gave an example of why, a very concrete example of why that is so important. Can you talk a little bit more about why it's so important that this conversation is including lots of different types of community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so in upstate New York, this is actually one of the bigger cities. We have Buffalo an hour and a couple minutes away to our west, and Syracuse about the same distance to our east. Of course, we have Albany along that line as well, but we have a lot of smaller cities. I'm a huge fan of Utica, New York, and I can get into that later. And that's a city of 60,000 people. Schenectady, about the same population there. I go to communities as, with 10,000 people, and I'm still seeing this conversation about, smart kind of urban revitalization. And obviously the smaller cities are doing it differently than the mid-size or the larger cities. But I think it's important to have this conversation because so often we think of urbanism, we think of New York, LA, Chicago, DC, all these monster metro areas. And the fact is, we inherently kind of as small to medium-sized cities, we have to approach different problems differently. For example, I think I used this example with you, when we talked earlier. When we advocate for public transportation, we don't do it here because, the average commute here is probably 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, okay? So we're not talking about Metro DC, where if you want something resembling an affordable house, you're gonna have to, be an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of the Metro DC, Baltimore area, right? Here, you can find tremendous affordability within 20 minutes of, any major employment hub here, including our own University of Rochester, our largest employer. So it's really easy to drive here. So when we talk about things like driving, and we talk about, kind of slowing the cars, when we talk about public transportation, the importance of that, cycling infrastructure, we can't use the excuse of the streets are jammed and it takes you forever to drive into where you're going. No, traffic flows very smoothly here, I assure you. So we have to use kind of different ways of showing the importance of these, of course, very important things, elements, to smart urbanism. We have to find a different way to convince people that these are better choices for our city, for our environment, for equity in our cities, and things of that nature. So that's just one example of the very different conversations that small and medium-sized cities, more drivable cities, have to have in order to get to where we want to be as far as a smart city, as far as a city that minimizes the automobile, that is, gets back to what a city really should be.
Yeah, I love that. And the blog of the podcast that you run, we will often highlight and republish some of the articles that you write, but there are a lot that we don't. And I hope people will take an opportunity to go visit the blog and to start listening to the podcast, because you're a real kindred spirit with Strong Towns, obviously. And you take a lot of the, we're talking about a lot of the same themes, but you are particularizing them often for your particular place in upstate New York. Now, that's not at all to suggest that what you're writing and recording is not relevant to people outside of upstate New York, because it absolutely is. If it wasn't, we wouldn't republish them so much. But I think you're doing a brilliant job at particularizing those themes for your place and providing a real model for folks who want to and could be doing the same.
Well, thank you so much. And when I just talked about, I think Strong Towns does beautifully. I think Strong Towns is one of the few places, one of the few blogs with national and now kind of international reach that really focuses on the elements of smart urbanism in smaller communities. I think sometimes that, I think people's first thought in a smaller community is cities mean skyscrapers. And I always tell people, no, it means people. Yes. Cities mean collections of people, however big, however small. And the important thing is a lot of the same elements that work in cities work very, very well in small communities. You just have to pitch it differently.
Yes.
And I think Strong Towns is a wonderful idea of connecting those really important central tenets of urbanism that people usually associate with big cities and connect them to small towns. And that's what I try to do a little bit myself. Is most of the cities that I visit and frequent. I was born in Chicago, so I love big city life, but I understand the beauty of what we have in our small to mid-sized cities as well. And it's really, really neat to see more and more people really appreciate that in the communities that I serve and the communities that I visit. Because when we're talking about what we're talking about, most cities, most urban areas, most communities in the country are having the same conversations. I think sometimes it's very easily to get insulated in our conversations in our communities or even our regions and say, this is only going on here. So for example, if I go to whatever city in New York State and I start up a conversation with somebody, tell me about what's going on in your city right now, especially a young person. They'll give me the same answer. They'll say, oh, we're going through a real renaissance right now. Well, every city's going through a real renaissance right now, or most are. And I think it's important for people to realize and connect people, especially in smaller communities, smaller cities, and let them know that they're not alone in these efforts and they're not unique. And sometimes that sounds like it's deflating, but it's not. We can share ideas, much, much better. And I think Strong Towns, I hope the Urban Phoenix has that potential and that ability to let people know that they're not alone in their efforts to strengthen their communities of whatever size.
So true. Yeah, this is something else we talked about before we started recording, but there's an organization that I'm affiliated with, and they kind of have this, they talk about this dual rhythm of being both rooted and linked. And if you are linked
Yes.
without being rooted, then you're kind of shallow. But if you're rooted without being linked, you end up being very siloed. But when you have that dual rhythm, that dual posture, maybe that's a better word.
Yes, sure. I know exactly what you mean.
You're rooted in your place. You're having an imagination for your place. You're connecting with the people who live there. But then you're also able to, like you just said, access all of these great ideas, best practices, lessons learned, from all over North America and
Yes.
beyond. And beyond. I mean, this is something we'll talk about in a little bit about how social media is inspiring us, with what's happening in Copenhagen or something,
Amsterdam and
Amsterdam.
Yeah. Sure.
Go ahead. I'm
go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead. Absolutely.
Well, I was going to say that one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because the Urban Phoenix, the site that you created, celebrated its 5th anniversary, 5th birthday recently, back in January 2015. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And I'm curious, when you started it 5 years ago, what was your original vision for the site? And has it changed over time?
It definitely has. I stumbled upon this by accident. I'll try to summarize this story because I tend to get a little long-winded with it, but it is kind of a neat one. I love to travel across the state by Amtrak, and I was traveling to New York City from Rochester one time. And we all have cities that if you ask the average person, say, what do you think of this city? And they say, oh, it's a hole, there's nothing there, or whatever. For upstate New York, often, not so much anymore, but in the past, that's been this little city of Utica, New York. And so I had never heard a good thing about Utica. And this is 2014, I think I'm traveling. I'm a photographer, so I was doing a photo shoot in New York City. And I was traveling there on train. It was the rainiest day, and I'm sitting in my Amtrak car with my face pressed up against the window, sitting in the Utica train station waiting for people to board. And I look outside, and there's people wandering around in an outdoor farmer's market, and right outside the train station. And I thought, look at there's people, laughing, smiling, happy, buying local stuff, and they're out in their rain gear and their umbrellas and stuff. And there's people talking, and I thought, man, this is a crummy day, and I've never heard anything good about this city, but these people look, there's got to be a reason 60,000 people live here. And so that gave me the idea to I was going to kind of do a photo tour and say, I bet you I can find some great resources in this town. I'm going to share it with people in my own city and try to change some minds and try to see what's going on here. Just explore for myself instead of take someone's word for for what people were saying about Utica. So yeah, I went to Utica with my camera, and I faced with the county tourist department first and foremost, just to kind of point me in the right direction. It's the thing with smaller cities, sometimes it's harder to stumble on stuff. So it's nice to have a little, you know, New York City, you can walk down the street and just go, oh. You have to kind of know in a smaller city where you're going a little bit. Another reason why the smartphones have really improved everything, because you can just know where you can see where you're going. And so I traveled to Utica. I was going to spend a day there, take some pictures, talk to some people. And I'll tell you what, I had one of the best days of my life. I would pop into a coffee shop and they'd say, you know what, I tell them what I was doing. They'd say, you got to check out this place. You got to see this. You got to photograph this. And the piece. So, you know, I had a great day. I visited art museums and the Saranac Brewery and took a tour there, and had amazing farm to table meal at this place. You know, popped in some other shops, talked to some other people. I had this incredible experience just in one day in a place that I had never heard a good thing about. I had so much fun, and people were so welcoming because there was finally a person out there that wasn't talking crap about their city. And you know, it was amazing. I didn't think the story was going to do anything. I didn't think the post was going to do anything, but it took me about 2 months to write it, to post all the pictures and write about my experience. And by the second day after, you know, I tagged some businesses in it and things like that. And after the second day, I had 25,000 views.
Wow.
My phone just would not shut up. It just kept buzzing. Within a couple days, I had TV interviews, radio interviews. The mayor invited me back, my wife and I back, and you know, to take a greater tour and to have lunch with the mayor and stuff like that. It was nuts. And it wasn't anything that I did. It was just that somebody actually reached out to this town that was trying really, really hard to do something great. And finally somebody from the outside was recognizing it.
Yes.
And it was just this kind of perfect storm. So I repeated that kind of tour, city tour, in these places that most people didn't know much about in my own city. And the same results played out. People ate it up. People loved it. And so from there, I kind of got interested as I went from city to city about, okay, the fluff is good and the excitement over this is good. How do we talk about what's working here? What are all these cities doing alike or differently that's working and creating you know, I hate to use this word sometimes, a more vibrant space or a more inviting city again? What is it that all these cities are doing that's helping people reconnect with the idea of urbanism, whether it be large city or small city? So I kind of started tilting the conversation away from just the city tours. And I still do a little bit of that I think it's important to get excited about our cities and what's happening. But now talking about, okay, what works? What do we have to do? What can every city do? What information can I share about what's working over here with people? And because there's still so many misnomers and so many, just stereotypes and things like that about cities. You know, how do I change that conversation? And that shift happened, and that was sometimes a painful shift as I was seeing my readership go way down, but then I slowly picked up another form of readership, and that was again bolstered a lot by Strong Towns and some of the pieces that you were sharing of mine. And it was just great to connect with that, you know, more kind of national audience. And what I saw from that was, sure enough, every city was having the same conversations. So that's kind of where, you know, it started as this kind of tour of these cities that nobody had anything good to say about, and showing that there was some great things there. And then it kind of morphed into this fascination that I had with smart urban development. And that led me, of course, to, you know, read every book and read every article. And I've gotten an education, self-made education very, very quickly in this field, and I'm learning stuff all the time, and I'm excited to really dive into, you know, continue to dive into kind of the central tenets behind smart urbanism.
You know, listening to the origin story of the Urban Phoenix, which I had not heard before, it's a reminder to me the power of focusing on what's working.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know that I personally can really focus on the negative, can focus on what's not working, all the problems. And I don't want to gloss over, paper over the problems. But there is something to be said for focusing on what is working and leaning into that, and letting people have the pride of place, and share that. And your story's a good reminder.
I think you're 100% right. I think, urbanists sometimes get into this thing where, hey, this new, we have this new headquarters for a major business that's going in our downtown. It's like, that's what you want, right? Like, somebody's coming down and gonna invest in our downtown, and it's great. It's gonna, and there's this page of people who just, all they want to talk about is the fact that, well, the building's ugly. Okay, but see the big picture. And look, I like great architecture. I really do. I like to see a higher standard of architecture. But in most of our cities and city design and all these things that we're talking about, we're talking about winning 7 times and losing 5 times. Mm-hmm. And it's seeing the big picture and getting excited and staying positive about about smart growth and about heading in the right direction in general. Not everything, maybe sometimes most things aren't going to work out the way you want them to, but it's just important to have that a little bit of a positive mindset. You can be positive and critical at the same time. That's what I always say.
And is the desire to stay positive one of the reasons why you have used the word robust belt rather than rust belt?
I do that a lot.
You talked about in a recent post, which I think we're going to get to, but I like that. It's an image of something that's flourishing rather than something that's decaying.
Definitely. When I using the term robust belt, I kind of sprinkle that in here and there because I like to. It's a rebranding. I think we've kind of. I don't look at the Rust Belt as necessarily a negative thing. I look at it as kind of what it is, right? I mean, we had major manufacturing in this part of the country that went away mostly due to automation, and we're trying to reimagine the bones of those structures and of that infrastructure, and I think just the rebranding and it's one more way of being able to look at cities a different way, not as these kind of cold, ugly, polluting manufacturing strongholds is necessarily the big places where everybody goes into and works and leaves, but places that can hold you in now. And like you mentioned, the power of place, and places where people can live, they can have a great time, where jobs still are plentiful, but it's just you have to get people out of the same vision of what we've always had for cities and start realizing a new tomorrow for our urban landscapes.
When you started the Urban Phoenix 5 years ago, what was or actually, let me put it this way. Over the 5 years that you've been doing the Urban Phoenix, have you seen the conversation around placemaking, urbanism, strong towns change in upstate New York?
Yeah, definitely I have. In the bigger cities like Rochester, Buffalo, and Syracuse, those conversations are full on happening. I'm seeing younger people making their way into local government, and that's been a real strength here in Rochester. I'm really, really excited about the people that are in place in our local government. They really get it. There's a lot of great young minds that understand the importance of smart urbanism, public transit, placemaking. We have a huge project here called Rock the Riverway. We have this really interesting kind of geographic situation upstate, or in our city of Rochester, I should say. We have the Erie Canal that goes just south of our city, and that's slowly turning it. Well, it's actually not slowly. It's turning into a place where people want to be. It's a really neat thing. The towns that it goes through are really thriving. But going kind of perpendicular to that north through the city of Rochester is the Genesee River. We have the tallest urban waterfall in the nation, 96 feet, right downtown. It's kind of a fun thing. But you know, we have this plan. Rochester has this plan, this 2034 plan, which is going to incorporate this Rock the Riverway campaign. We're completely reimagining our connection to the Genesee River, and really expanding that for walkability, for just, you know, for beauty, for commuting, because that pathway connects our biggest employer, University of Rochester, to downtown Rochester. So you're starting to see people get not just placemaking and the importance of that, but the connections around what placemaking means. You know, downtown, for example, from Strong Museum of Play, we have an organization, several organizations, one of the Healthy Kids, that is creating like a play walk, basically, with, you know, on-street instruments and just kind of fun nuance that kids can connect with as they're, you know, in between where they park and walk to the Strong Museum of Play, because that brings in so many families across our community. So yeah, I mean, I'm seeing this all over the place. There is definitely, in the last 10 years, a much higher appreciation for placemaking, for public transportation, and for connecting all those kind of evolving pieces in our cities.
That's really cool. That's really great. I want to get into a blog post that you wrote recently, where you were sort of reflecting back on the 5 years of the Urban Phoenix, and you talked about 5 lessons that you've learned. And I'm wondering if you would mind if we kind of went through those quickly, and
sure,
or not so quickly. I guess quickly, because we have limited time.
Yes, yeah.
But quicker than I would prefer, because I would like a sort of a long, lingering conversation.
Sure.
I don't have time for that.
I'll short up.
But I thought that these were really interesting, and absolutely worthy of continued discussion. We'll obviously include a link to the blog post itself, so that folks can go even deeper if they want. The first lesson you mentioned was around housing and racial inequality. Mm-hmm. And you actually described these as 2 of the most difficult hurdles that cities are facing, and that they're intertwined in many ways. And I'm wondering if you would mind talking a little bit about some of the economic and zoning decisions that were made in the early 20th century that really have divided American cities along racial lines, mm-hmm. and how that legacy is still very much active today.
Yeah, I mean, our cities were formed so much by the way, you know, if anybody out there is going to read one book that kind of tells you how the structure of our cities formed, The Color of Law is an incredibly powerful book. If you have never read it, it is one of the most comprehensive books talking about how racism was systematically painted, literally drawn into our city maps. You know, so in the 1930s, you know, when basically there's a big one. I'm trying to put this down to a digestible comment here. The concept of redlining in our cities really came through in the 1930s, where the federal government and loan organizations came together and basically created maps of where banks should and could invest within each, I think 239 cities, United States cities, they went into, and basically created maps and color-coded maps saying, invest in these areas or give these people low interest loans, and don't allow any investment in or out of these areas that were outlined in red. That's known as redlining. And notoriously, those areas that were outlined in red were minority-based neighborhoods, were, you know, particularly African-American neighborhoods. And the trick with this was that even if you were a person of means living in a Black community, you could not, if you lived in that community and wanted to move outside of there, it was very, very difficult to do so. It was very hard to get a loan to, or even to move out of your community and into a community that was not highlighted in red on that map. Furthermore, it really disallowed outside investment in those communities. So they became islands of poverty, basically at the hands of our government influence. And that impact, as areas grew wealth around the outside of our cities, while these redlined areas in the center of our cities were basically disallowed investment, that creation of wealth over generations has led to what the hollowed out cities that we see today. And at the same time, of course, we built highways allowing us to get out of our cities as fast as possible. The interesting thing about like the GI Bill, for example, a lot of people think that's just a wonderful thing that happened in our nation, but most people don't realize that 63,000 Americans coming home from war took advantage of low interest loans, home loans, through the GI Bill. 100 of them were African American. Wow. The loan process itself, the loans themselves were not racist, but the veterans organizations in most cities were charged with kind of divvying out those loans and who got them and who didn't. And those organizations were often notoriously racially biased. So that was, you had, tens of thousands of Americans coming home, creating wealth on the outskirts of their cities where it was cheaper to build. And you had African Americans coming home and not having the same opportunity to create that wealth. And that creates, that has ripple effects into our poorest communities today, into our housing today, into the fact that for decades, we didn't build any new housing in our communities. So we don't have that mid-range kind of 20-year-old housing, apartment style housing in our cities. We just have high-end and really old and blighted in so many of our areas. And, finding that middle road, affordable housing is the big question in our cities. That's a big piece of it. That's a big kind of artifact of that legislation. And it's, that kind of, the effects of redlining and racial kind of disparity in our cities really played out legally into the mid to late 70s in a lot of areas. And obviously socially still continues to play out today.
Yeah. I was visiting some friends in Canton, Ohio last summer, and they told me the story, and I don't remember all of the details, so I won't try to get into all of the details, but one of the sort of key founders or key figures in the history of Canton was this very wealthy white man. And like one of the ways in which they designated which neighborhoods were we're going to exclude African Americans was they were going to, they planted different types of trees in white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. Like in the white neighborhoods, they imported all of these trees from I think even from Europe, like not only outside of Ohio, but like I think outside of the country.
Wow.
And to this day, many, many decades later, as you walk through these neighborhoods, you can tell where the actual line was, because all of a sudden these old trees, they switch species. And it's a visual reminder of the racist legacy of redlining in Canton.
That's incredible. Yeah. I mean, here in Rochester, we have, it's that, among other things, it's our expressways that slice through poor black neighborhoods and that were considered blighted. They were tremendous places of community that weren't appreciated. And of course, in the name of progress and the automobile, we cut those neighborhoods up. And that Buffalo is as bad as any city that way, as far as what happened to Buffalo's neighborhoods, and redlining was a huge piece of that.
Yeah. Yep. The second lesson you mentioned in the post is that cities are the cities that will achieve economic success are the cities that are focusing on people. And this is critical because the way a lot of cities try to generate new jobs is by offering these huge subsidies. And this is ultimately what we at Strong Towns describe as a kind of a race to the bottom that also ultimately leaves the community weaker. And you point to a different way: focus on the people. What do you mean by that? Focus on the people.
Yeah, I mean, major employers. What are major employers looking for? When all things being equal, companies like Amazon, that's the one thing that just pops into mind. But if a company is looking to expand or relocate, right, and they're saying, hey, we want to go somewhere, how many, every single community USA that needs jobs, which is every single community USA, because that looks good, right? That's what everybody wants, jobs, 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 jobs. So what do we do when a major company says, we're looking to expand? We just open the bank for with subsidies, right? And we just dump these subsidies, you know, it's like a bidding war. And, you know, all things being equal, if all communities are going to subsidize jobs, let's just go there. Let's just say that. Yeah. What do you have as a community that's different? And that's my thing is, you have to have things in your community that next tier of things that a company looking to relocate maybe people at its current location to, you know, can take into account. Now, if you can see that, you know, this community is subsidizing us like every other community, but they've got good public transportation, and that gives more people access to jobs here quickly and easily. They have, you know, a vibrant nightlife. They have great family resources. They've invested in a human-centered city where people are happy and healthy. And that's what employers are really, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for that edge. I mean, every city needs that kind of, that little edge that says, look, all things being equal, we have a cooler place. Yeah. We have a better place for family and for community and you know, and for prosperity. Yeah. That's what it's about, is about fertilizing the soil and allowing growth to come, or allowing growth to, it's opening the doors to growth by creating a stronger, more attractive community for everybody.
I love that metaphor of fertilizing the soil, because you can kind of think of it as, you know, if the subsidies are sort of these top down, you know, quick growth chemicals, yeah. You know, yeah. Focusing on the health of the soil. Instead, you know, focusing on the health of the community. This is a place where people actually want to live. They're happier here, which means that they're more productive. Let's focus on the roots of what makes a place great.
Absolutely.
The third lesson is that, and this one was fascinating for me in multiple ways. You said that generally speaking, cities are not that different from one another, and you made a really interesting case there. Can you unpack that part of the piece first? Like, what did you mean that cities are that? In what way are cities so similar?
Yeah, I think cities are similar in that they're. I always say this. They're. I've said this before. They're collections of people. So people are not uniquely kind of people follow the same trends. You put, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, let's say, together, and they're going to kind of react the same way to environmental shifts, economic shifts, and things like that this group is over here. You give people the same environment or the same environmental influences and constructs, and they're probably going to react the same. And, you know, again, when we talk about all of our cities and the history of our cities, I'm not necessarily talking about some of the newer cities out west, but for, you know, 75% of this country, our urban conversation is the same. Manufacturing was a huge part of our cities, and, you know, our cities were built around manufacturing jobs, and then that went away. And along with, you know, policies that, like I said before, were outright, you know, racist early in the 20th century and through the mid 20th century. And that also, you know, coupled with the fact that we made it very easy to leave our cities and then hollowed out the fabric of our cities through urban renewal. What city, USA, didn't experience some sort of element, you know, some sort of combination of these elements? Yeah. So, you know, if from here to, you know, Detroit to down to, you know, Columbus and down the East Coast, all of these cities have kind of experienced the same conversation. It was great. We lost 40% of our people. Now we've got this kind of quiet, you know, revitalization effort. We're on some kind of continuum of this revitalization effort, and we're working to get there. And a lot of those efforts, a lot of those the ways people are coming back to it are the same. So I don't see cities as that different. As I go into each individual city, I see very similar problems, and I see very similar attempts at solutions, and usually they're pretty close. They're pretty spot on as people that want to reimagine, reinvigorate their cities through hard work and through kind of seeing their urban areas a different way. So when I talk about the history of cities to the 20th and early 21st century, that's what I'm talking about. They're very, very similar, and thus we can learn a lot from each other if we continue to share that information.
Yeah, this was it was in this lesson that you talked about the role of social media in making our cities, making them more vibrant, but also showing how vibrant they already were. And that's not something I had ever really thought about before.
Generations of people, growing up in the suburbs, myself included, I was born in Chicago, but I spent, 20 years living in a suburb 20, 25 minutes south of Rochester. And, I didn't think that Rochester, this hollowed out city, could have elements of what my Chicago that I loved so much when I was a kid. I didn't think that it could have elements of that. And so I got introduced to Rochester and the beautiful things about Rochester kind of earlier on. What I think was really, really turning people on to cities now is this, now this area that you've been kind of estranged from for so long, people are starting to take pictures. People are starting to post on Instagram this cool place they ate, or this amazing, there's people living in suburban Rochester that have never gone to High Falls. Here in Rochester, like I said, this incredible urban waterfall that we have. We have a bridge that goes across a gorge. The Genesee Brewery is there. We have this amazing area that so many people in our community didn't see for decades because it was blighted and empty and there was nothing there. But photography and social media and seeing your friends visit these places and take these beautiful pictures has reinvited people into the conversation of, that our cities can be these amazing places again, because for decades, we were just told not to go there. We were told not to go to the city center because we were going to get shot. That's a terrible stereotype, but it was true. Yeah. And when people started seeing their friends go to these places and take these pictures and see, wow, the architecture is cool, and this new restaurant is cool, and this new bar is cool, and this new shop is cool, people started responding and saying, I got to check this out too. I think social media has been one of the most powerful elements to leading to the revival of our urban cores.
I love that. That's a hot take here on the Strong Towns. I think that's awesome. That's great.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. That's when really everything started exploding, is when people started being able to see our cities again, literally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so cool. Very cool. The fourth lesson is that we should attack the low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. And so why should we attack the low-hanging fruit when, frankly, the problems seem so massive?
Because, for a couple of reasons. One, if you attack a big problem, if you attack if you focus on one thing in your city, if you don't like where this building is going, okay, because you think it should be something different. And I had to learn this over time, because I won't get into it here, and you spend 2 or 3 years fighting that, and it ultimately goes in, and you've thrown resources and time and effort and aggravation into this, in council meetings and things like that, and this building gets built anyway. Yeah. What if you had taken those resources and moved them over to a non-contested area and said, we're going to take what we've spent in this area, which ultimately didn't lead to anything, and repurpose that energy and that investment in an area of low-hanging fruit. My friend Rachel Walsh really turned me on to this, and she made me think about cities differently this way. Very smart person. And, and I think sometimes going small and doing the little things you can do, and I'm talking about, anything from making sure your sidewalk is plowed, is taken care of out front of your place, to maybe planting some plants along your walkway, to, just, working on revitalizing or reactivating a neighborhood, doing a clean sweep, something like that. You know, it's the little things that we can all do to pitch in that make a much bigger victory. And I think we get overwhelmed at times by everything that we have to do. But it's a lot of little wins that are going to improve our cities. You know, those massive ones hopefully will come too. But remember that there's a lot of other smaller areas to reinvest our efforts that are completely uncontested. And I always say, for our own sanity too, as we sometimes this is hard. Sometimes changing minds and trying to do something different after decades of doing it the wrong way, it grinds on you. And every urbanist knows this. Every activist knows this. So sometimes for your own sanity, you need to attack those small victories and rack up those small victories, because, you know, it's good for your city and it's good for your psyche.
Yeah, absolutely. You say that, you know, you want people to be passionate, but you also encourage people to be unemotional about it, because
you have to.
Because there will be losses. For every 2 steps forward, we're going to take 1 step back. And actually, I think you said for every 10 steps forward, we're going to take 9 steps back.
Yeah.
So, you know,
but you're still moving forward.
But you have to guard yourself and prepare yourself.
You have to be able to take losses, and you have to be able to see where to step back and see where your efforts might be better spent. I think that's key.
Yep. Well, the final lesson is that you wrote about is that one person can make a difference. And as you've been doing this work for 5 years now, can you tell us about 1 or 2 people that you've met who had a real impact on their town or city?
Yeah, I definitely can.
You know, these are folks who would have stood out for you.
I definitely can. I'm going to go to the first place kind of that I visited in Utica, New York, and there's a small group of people, young people, called Made in Utica, and this is a grassroots organization. I mean, you know, organization. It started just, you know, a couple of young people that really just were tired of people, you know, dumping on their city, and wanted to create a you know, a sense of, you know, place and vibrancy, and just a reimagining what they had and saying, hey, let's look at what we've got here. We've got some great resources. Let's build on that. And you know, this group has done a great job with just a couple of people of really, they now are they have their finger on the pulse of the city. I mean, and sometimes they dictate the pulse of the city. And these are a few people really changing the minds of 60,000 people and beyond in a small city. So, you know, that for me is one of the truest grassroots pieces that I've seen. Another example is in Troy, New York. A gentleman named Vic Christopher, who got priced out of Brooklyn, wanted to create that kind of vibe in an upstate New York City. So he moved to Troy and took an old abandoned building, invested in it, and turned it into an incredible business. And then businesses built around there based on his enthusiasm. He said, "Come on in, let's do this." And he would, you know, if you walk down the street of new businesses, incredible places, restaurants, shops, really, they have the 3rd largest farmers market now. It's like 30,000 people or something like that. They have the 3rd largest farmers market in New York State. And if you go along these businesses, that so many of them attribute what's happening to this one person who came in and had this idea and had this excitement and rallied the troops. And he continues to be a leader in that community, and it's really, really, really amazing to see. But these are just 2 individuals or people among, you know, hundreds, thousands of people that I've seen that have made real, you know, appreciable, you know, strides for their communities and beyond. It's amazing to see with a little, you know, social media influence once again, what one person can do or what a small group of people can do. You know, my blog has been read over 500,000 times. I'm one person. You know, I have people writing every week saying, you know, you've changed the way I've seen I see my city or my community, and that means something to me. That means a lot. But more importantly, I'm amazed sometimes. It's not me. It's just people connect with the ideas. But it is amazing. I kind of do look back and say I'm shocked at what has happened as a result of the Urban Phoenix. And it's really, really amazing to see. One person can make a difference. One person can change minds, can influence us, and really take our cities into a new era.
Absolutely. I love that. And that seems like the perfect note on which to kind of draw our conversation to a close. And I totally agree with it. And you are doing that work. Like, this is why I wanted to talk to you, because I read that and I thought, yeah, like Arian, like he is, like he's having an impact. Like and I just love the work that you're doing. And I wanted to highlight it a little bit more. And you've just been such an important part of Strong Towns for so long. Even before I was content manager, I had read the site for years. And so I'm just really, really grateful for the work that you're doing. I want to encourage people to not just wait for us to republish like some of what you're writing, because you're writing so much. The podcast is amazing. We didn't even really get into the podcast. It's not only is. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just saying, people are, the reason I'm getting the podcast and the video piece of it, even more than the blog now, is people are connecting with media in different ways now.
Yes.
And I want to, it's important for all organizations, as Strongtown knows, to really become more multimedia conscious.
Yes.
in our content and what we're putting out there, how we're sharing our message.
One of my favorite things that you've done recently, and I'll include this too in the article, is the video that you took. It was 5 hours. Where were you? Like 5 hours?
Syracuse. Yeah.
In Syracuse.
Yeah.
And it's a short. The video that you compiled is ultimately like kind of it's shorter. But I loved coming with you on this journey. I thought it was so cool. And you just have a particular approach to podcasting that you're doing right now. This is something you and I have talked about on the phone before that I think is so cool. I kind of think of it as like guerrilla podcasting.
Guerrilla podcasting. I love that. Can
you talk a little bit about your approach to podcasting? Because I think it's really interesting, and it's honestly, I mean this very literally. It has inspired me to think about doing something similar for my own town. And so can you talk about your approach to podcasting? Because I think you've created a kind of a template here that lots of people could be inspired with.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, it's I use Anchor. It's an app on my phone. Seriously, I think people get into the gear. They find the room that they want to pad the walls, and create the sound dampening, and they get the $300 microphone and the mixer set up and everything like that. Honestly, I do it with Anchor and a little kind of and GarageBand. That's how I put in the music and stuff like that. So, I have a lot of enthusiasm for what I talk about, and I feel like sometimes that doesn't come through in the blog. So the podcast for me is a way to express my enthusiasm and let people hear that, and let people hear that passion that I do have with regard to the issues that I talk about. So it's for me, it's more personal. So that was one I really wanted to connect with. And I try to keep it very informal too. But seriously, I talk into my phone on this Anchor app, and I'm talking, I kneel on my bed and put a pillow in front of me. And that's my sound dampening. I do it, my wife, God bless her, she has to, she works some nights, and she's kind enough to let me do this in the living room today, but usually she's gone when I record these, and I just record a string of them at a time so I don't annoy her to death. But honestly, it fits into my life really well, because that's another thing. When you put out this much content, and anybody who writes knows this, it gets into your life, and you have to make sure that you're maintaining that life work or whatever this is balance. And the podcasting really has allowed me to do that. So I can spend 15 minutes and spit out an idea that isn't fully formed, but I can kind of work through it. And that's what I've really, really found is great about this kind of, like you said, guerrilla podcasting. I do interviews too.
Yes,
Anchor allows you to do remote interviews that the quality is a little sketchy, but it's content, and that's what people really are going to want to connect with, is interesting people and interesting conversations. So it's never been easier to do a podcast. The one thing I would say, audience builds slowly, especially for this topic. This is a very specific topic. I think people think they're going to get 1,000 listens right away, and that does not happen. So build it in slowly to whatever else you're doing, and don't get frustrated. Just keep putting stuff out there.
Totally agree. The episodes that I've listened to from you, like, it feels more intimate, which I love. I think that's one of the great things about podcasting. I really like the interview episodes that you've done.
Yeah.
And I just think, again, what you're doing is it will appeal to people far beyond upstate New York. But for folks who are interested in doing like a hyper local podcast, and they don't have or don't want to get all of that equipment, it's so easy. And
so easy.
You can do that work of beginning to change hearts, change minds of your community. And I just think that I really want folks to check out what you're doing, because it's really, really cool.
Yeah, it's never been easier for, like you said, we just talked about it, for one person's voice to become very loud. Yeah. And you can really use that to your advantage. Now, you just have to be smart and very, very patient about it, because it doesn't always click right away. Yeah. I've tried 50 different ideas, and every 50 ideas I try or so, maybe one works. So just keep at it and keep trying new things. Don't get frustrated. Just keep trying to get the right message out there, and try to find an artery for that message, or multiple outlets for that message. I think that's really, really important, but it is easier to do that than it ever has been.
Well, ultimately, I think one of the things that makes your approach stand out is just your generosity. You have a very generous approach to this, and I'm just really grateful. And you're generous to be here today. I really want to encourage folks to go to theurbanphoenix.com and to check out your work, to follow you, subscribe to the blog, subscribe to the podcast. And again, thank you so much for everything you've done for Strong Towns over the years, for all the great work you're doing in Rochester and far beyond. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, to Strong Towns, I mean, the same thing. You're giving a voice to people that haven't had it for a long time. You're exposing a population of people that maybe feel left out in the urban conversation. You're including them in that conversation. You're giving voice to people like me across the country, and sometimes across the world, an opportunity to share our message of our communities and what we're doing. So you fill such an important role in the urban revitalization conversation, and the revitalization of our communities, and the smart growth of our communities. And I cannot thank Strong Towns enough for doing that. I think that's so important today as we go forward in our country.
That's really cool. I'm going to make sure that all of the staff people hear the last part, just because, because sometimes I would imagine we think, okay, why are we doing this?
We all do that. We ask each other.
We have the mission statement to memorize, but why are we doing that? So this will be good. It'll be a good boost. Thank you for saying that.
Absolutely. We all need that reinforcement. It's important we all realize each other's role in a much bigger and more important conversation.
Totally. All right. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.